In Laboratory Reddit, today's story is...
My grandfather heard that my parents called me a family embarrassment for not getting married at 28. His reaction on the wedding anniversary changed our whole family dynamic. I'm 28 years old and have been in a relationship with my boyfriend Orson, who is 29, for about 4 years. For the last year and a half, we have been in a long-distance relationship because I had to move to another city for a work project I am involved in. Despite the distance, we have managed to make our relationship work well, and we plan to get married at some point. However, for now, we are both focused on our professional careers. Although we have talked about marriage, it is not an immediate priority for us, and personally I think that is perfectly fine. What I don't understand is why my parents have such a problem with this situation. In recent months, every time I visited them or spoke to them on the phone, they inevitably brought up the subject of my wedding. They kept telling me that I should get married because I've been with Orson for 4 years now, and besides, I'm approaching 30. According to their reasoning, if I want to settle down, start a family and all that, now is the ideal time and there's no reason to keep putting off getting married. I have tried to explain to them many times that our professional careers are currently our priority. I have made it clear to them that I cannot return home before my project is finished, which will take another 6 to 9 months. Once it is finished, I will move back. Then, naturally, we will talk about our future and possibly get engaged. After that, we'll need a few extra months to plan the wedding. But honestly, we have no problem taking things slowly. For us, marriage is not an urgency, but simply a formality that we will eventually address. Nothing more. We know we love each other. We don't need an official document to prove it to anyone, and I don't understand why my parents can't understand this. They would make a big deal out of it every time we brought it up, and I was getting tired of it, so I started calling them less often and distancing myself a bit. Last week, I called to congratulate them on their 30th wedding anniversary, and also to confirm that I would be attending the celebration at the weekend. Once again, they brought up the subject of my marriage and went so far as to suggest that I should seriously consider giving up my job. I felt they were overstepping the mark, so I told them straight that this was why I hardly ever spoke to them anymore. We ended up having a big argument. In the end, they told me not to bother attending any more family gatherings until I had a ring on my finger because it was embarrassing for them. They were tired of having to explain to everyone that Orson and I were still just dating, without even being engaged. Their words hurt me deeply, but before I could respond, they simply hung up the phone. After that conversation, I called Orson and ended up crying for a long time because his words had really hurt me. He consoled me, and eventually I felt better. Despite everything, I decided to go to my city that weekend as planned, mainly because I wanted to see Orson. On the day of the celebration, I was at home in the afternoon. A few hours after the party had started, my grandfather called me asking why I hadn't arrived yet, as I'm not usually one of the granddaughters who are late, especially to events organized by my parents, so I had to tell him the truth. My grandfather, who is my dad's father, and I have a very close relationship, so he was worried about me, plus we hadn't seen each other for a while. After listening to the whole situation, he simply replied, "I see," and then told me he would call me later, after the party. Later, I found out everything that happened at the celebration. A few minutes after speaking to me on the phone, my grandfather decided to give a speech at the party. But surprisingly, he didn't talk about my parents, but instead he started talking about me. More specifically, about how my parents had been pressuring me to get married. He described it as if my parents had received a dowry from my boyfriend's family, and I was obliged to get married to return the favor. My parents had been telling anyone who asked about me, including my grandfather, that I was simply delayed. That was their excuse to justify my absence. But then my grandfather told everyone the truth, leaving my parents in a very uncomfortable position when the real story was revealed. All the guests began to look at them disapprovingly, while my grandfather continued speaking. And to top it all off, he ended his speech by saying that my parents had called me an embarrassment, just because I wasn't married at 28, simply because they felt judged by some critical relatives who had nothing better to do than to meddle in other people's lives, but that in reality he was more proud of me than he had ever been of my father. At least, I had managed to become independent and didn't need my father's help to get a job. My grandfather called my parents stupid and said they would have been nothing if their own parents hadn't constantly supported them. because, unlike me, they never focused on developing their careers. According to him, they were always too busy trying to impress others, and for that reason, for years they depended on their parents to support them financially, raise their children, and even buy their house. He told them directly that, in reality, they should be ashamed of themselves instead of being ashamed of me. After saying all this, he left, along with other people who also started to leave the party. My parents called me immediately afterwards to yell at me. This happened a couple of days ago, and they are extremely upset with me. They argue that, knowing how temperamental my grandfather is, I could have made up some excuse to prevent him from reacting like that in the middle of the celebration. However, according to them, I decided to play the victim, provoking my grandfather to do what he did. This not only ruined the party atmosphere, but also caused many guests to leave prematurely. And they don't just accuse me with these unreasonable arguments, they also want me to convince my grandfather to issue a formal apology to all those present, because many people left quickly after the speech without my parents being able to give their version or try to calm the situation. At this point, I don't feel guilty at all, because I was always taught that the truth is the most important thing, and I simply told the truth. If my parents have a problem with that, maybe the problem is with them. And I'm definitely not going to try to convince my grandfather to apologize. If he doesn't think he did anything wrong, which I believe is the case, and he wants to maintain his position, it's completely his decision. I'm not going to tell a grown man what to do, especially after everything he's done for my parents. He deserves to express whatever he wants at the party and leave whenever he wants. And if they had lifted him on their shoulders while chanting his name, so much the better. That's my story with my parents. Edit. I thought that my grandfather's speech clarified the context quite well, but I can see that you want more information. Basically, my parents got married very young, when they were around 24. At that time, they were just starting their professional careers and depended considerably on their parents for almost everything. When I was born, they were experiencing financial difficulties because they didn't know how to manage their money well. As a result, their parents had to lend them money on numerous occasions. After I was born, they became even more dependent on their parents, with the additional expenses that having a baby entails, and from what I have heard, they did so without any shame or qualms. Obviously, I have never mentioned this issue directly with my parents, because I know it is something they are ashamed of. My father has now achieved some professional success, but it took him many years and a lot of help from my grandfather. My grandfather allowed my father to take over his company just a few years ago, but only after he proved himself competent enough to run it. It's not a big company, it only has a few employees, but it was a big vote of confidence from my grandfather to hand over his life's work to him. Personally, I'm not interested in that kind of work, and I have to admit that everything my grandfather said about me being an independent person is completely true. Since graduating from university, I have received very little financial support from my parents, and I have never asked for it. I am proud of that independence, and I am definitely proud of not being like them in that respect. Of course, I have never confronted them about this situation because I don't want to be that kind of person, but I am glad that my grandfather expressed what he thought. I don't understand why I should feel bad about it. It's not like he was lying. My parents tried to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my career over marriage. It's true that they care excessively about what other people think of them, which is strange, considering that they should be more concerned about my well-being than about other people's opinions. Anyway, some aspects are quite personal, and my grandfather decided to expose them publicly. That's mainly why my parents are so angry now. Update 1. I'm back at work. I was only in my hometown for the weekend. And of course, I've been in touch with my granddad since the party. I didn't mention it in my original post because I forgot, but I did talk to him about what happened, the speech he gave, and the whole situation. As I expected, he doesn't regret what he did at all. He was very direct and firm on the subject. He explained to me that, after talking to me during the party, he was completely outraged. He couldn't believe that my parents had said something so hurtful, especially them with their history. Although my grandfather is not usually an impulsive person, he pointed out that my parents had several days to apologize if they had said something without thinking, but they didn't. Therefore, it is clear that they really meant what they said. It's not as if they didn't have the opportunity to rectify the situation. They still had a couple of days before the party to talk to me, to make things right, to apologize or to retract. But they chose not to, because, for them, the opinion of some relatives I have barely seen a couple of times in my life about my marriage was more important than my own wishes and decisions. He couldn't tolerate that because, in his words, it was simply disgusting and pathetic. When I told him that, after he left, my parents called me to yell at me and blame me for everything that had happened, he advised me not to worry about what they think. According to him, the only thing they care about is their own image. And my grandfather doesn't feel any remorse for what he said either. His only regret is not having had more time to prepare a more elaborate speech. But I assured him that the one he gave was quite effective, as my parents' reaction was priceless. As for my parents, I have decided not to communicate with them anymore, at least until they offer me a sincere apology. Until then, I have silenced them on my devices and will not respond to any of their messages or calls. I'm doing it for my own peace of mind. Update 2. For the sake of time reference, it's been 2 weeks since my last communication with my parents. During all that time, I haven't bothered to check any of their messages. Today was a relatively quiet day at work, and, out of curiosity, I finally decided to read them. Most of them said the same thing, that they were disappointed in me, that they never expected me to behave this way. They listed all the reasons why I was a bad daughter and similar things. By now it doesn't affect me as much, especially after my conversation with my grandfather. So I didn't think too much about it and went back to concentrating on my work. By an incredible coincidence, today was also the day my parents decided to contact Orson. I don't understand why they felt the need to involve him, because until now, apart from comforting me when I was down, he hadn't been involved in this situation at all. I don't think he felt particularly sad about missing my parents' anniversary party anyway, considering that we hadn't been in the same city for a long time because of my work. They called him and started trying to manipulate him emotionally, telling him that they had always treated him like a son, that they had accepted him into the family unquestioningly, and that they had always been good to him. And because of all that, according to them, now as his future son-in-law, it was their responsibility to talk some sense into me and convince me to reply to their messages. They practically told him he owed them that favor. Orson is a rather reserved person and generally avoids conflict, so he didn't respond to them much. He simply listened to them, and before ending the call, he told them he would talk to me. And he did, but not to pressure or influence me, only to tell me what had happened. However, from his tone of voice, I could tell that he was really offended by the way my parents spoke to him. I can imagine exactly what happened. I know they didn't directly insult him or shout at him, but they have a particular way of speaking, that condescending and irritating tone when they address someone with an air of superiority. I know it well because I've experienced it all my life. I was really angry that they decided to involve Orson in this matter when he had no relation to the problem. This conflict was between my family and me. And yes, Orson is my family, but in a completely different sense. Although apparently for my parents he is not, which makes it even more incomprehensible that they involved him when, according to their logic, I don't even have a ring on my finger. More importantly, it's absurd that they think he can make me do anything. He's not my boss, just as I'm not my grandfather's boss. We can't force each other to do things. Why do they find it so hard to understand that? I was already a bit irritated after reading all their messages, and then this happened, which made me even more angry. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I called them to talk to them and set the record straight once and for all. As soon as I dialed their number, they answered immediately. It was as if they were sitting by the phone, with their finger poised on the answer button, ready to press it as soon as my call came in. But I was ready too, so I took the initiative. I made it very clear to them that they had no right to involve Orson in this problem. I explained that this was a matter between us, and I would appreciate it if they would act with dignity and keep it that way. I also confronted them for having spoken to Orson as if he owed them some favor, because he really owes them nothing. They have done nothing extraordinary for him. They have simply been polite, as they would be to any guest or acquaintance. That is just basic courtesy. It doesn't mean they have done him any special favors. Nor have they truly accepted him into our family in any meaningful way, and this business of referring to him as their future son-in-law had to stop. I told them clearly that they needed to take a step back, and that it was absurd that, after everything that had happened, they still hadn't learned their lesson. That they should stop obsessing about my wedding, my love life, and everything related to it, and just leave me alone. They immediately started arguing. According to them, my lack of consideration or love towards them was reflected in the way I was acting. They accused me of behaving terribly towards them and said they never expected this attitude from me. But I simply repeated what my grandfather had told me. If they had no problem hurting me by telling me not to attend family events unless I was engaged, and if they didn't care how that made me feel, then I wouldn't worry if my words or actions hurt them either. But they had another tactic up their sleeve, although, like all their strategies, it was about manipulating me. However, I know all their tactics. It's not my first confrontation with them. Although now it seems to be evolving into a kind of global family war, because my grandfather and other relatives have joined in. Some, like my grandfather, more confrontational, and others simply supporting me silently. My mother claimed that all she wanted from me was good things. She wanted to see me married, with a baby and experiencing all the joys that marriage supposedly brings. That she was just trying to give me that little push to finally take the step towards my wedding. She was obviously exaggerating, deliberately trying to make me feel guilty, but I didn't fall for it. I replied that if she really wanted what was best for me, she would have respected my position instead of constantly trying to put pressure on me. But that was exactly what she and my father had been doing all this time. I made it clear to them that I am not a sheep in a herd that they can direct as they please. And that was the real problem, wasn't it? They just wanted me to follow their orders blindly, like when I was a child, that I didn't question anything, that I didn't form my own opinions, that I didn't think for myself. And now that I don't obey them unquestioningly, I've become the villain who's destroying my poor parents. I reminded them that over the last few months, I had repeatedly explained to them that I was away for work reasons, that things were already difficult enough for me, that my job was exhausting, and that leading a team was not exactly easy. I do the best I can in these circumstances, but even so, at the end of the day, I return to an empty house. I miss home, I miss everyone. It's not like I enjoy being away. But I have to do it because this is a great professional opportunity, and Orson understands that perfectly, being the person I care about most in all of this. He respects my decisions, and if he's okay with this situation, why is it so hard for them, my own parents, to understand it's not like I'm going to marry them? In fact, they should be even more understanding, because they know I'm doing something difficult but necessary for my career. Instead, they had the audacity to suggest that I quit my job and move back home to get married. I asked them if they had even considered the consequences of that proposal. I told them straight out that I didn't want to end up like them, borrowing money from their parents, not planning for the future, worrying only about what other people thought of me. That's not who I am, and I never want to be like that. And since they couldn't respect that, the best thing they could do was simply to stay out of my life. My mother was crying so much while saying something about me being her daughter and that she never wanted to hurt me, that my father had to pick up the phone. He told me that what she had said was unforgivable, that I had to retract it or else they would never speak to me again. I replied that it was fine with me, that it was the best offer I had had in months, and that was the end of it. They hung up the phone and blocked me on every possible platform. And honestly, it doesn't affect me in the slightest. There won't be an ending to my update here where I say that I'm going to miss them or that I feel bad, because I don't. All I ever wanted was to be left alone, and that's exactly what they've offered me, something I'm definitely not going to refuse. Update 3. It's been a couple of days since my parents blocked me everywhere. The day after they did it, I called my grandfather and told him in detail everything that had happened. He listened to me carefully, and when I finished my story, he simply told me he was proud of me. If I needed someone's opinion to confirm that what I did was right, that someone was my grandfather. After that conversation, I concentrated on my work and put the matter to one side. But this morning, my grandfather called me again and told me that last night there was a big drama with my parents. Apparently, they showed up at his house unannounced and started accusing him of instigating me against them all this time. So here we are again. My parents can't convince me to be their loyal follower, so they decide to harass other people. First, they tried to get me to talk to my grandfather to convince him to apologize publicly for the speech he gave on his anniversary. But weeks have passed, and I doubt very much that anyone would care about that apology at this point. Besides, my grandfather has already made it perfectly clear that he has no intention of apologizing under any circumstances. That ship has long since sailed. All their strategies revolve around manipulation. The only thing that changes is the person at whom it is directed. They tried it with me, and now they are trying it with my grandfather. For example, it is evident in what they did. Instead of continuing to try to get me to convince my grandfather to apologize, now they are trying to get him to convince me to apologize to them. So they went to his house, accused him of provoking me, of brainwashing me against them, and of manipulating me into distancing myself from them. They told him that it was now his responsibility to make things right and to make me apologize and get back on good terms with them. When my grandfather replied that he wasn't going to do that in fact everything he had said was true, and that maybe they should reflect on their own actions instead of trying to manipulate me, my father completely lost control. He started to shout in his face, the same father who gave him a good job, a place where he can earn good money without trying too hard. It's not a simple mistake, it's a very serious error of judgment. The situation became so tense that my grandfather genuinely thought that my father was going to push him or even hit him. It didn't come to that, but only because my mother stopped him at the last moment. Even so, he didn't stop shouting. He simply continued to vent his fury on my grandfather, saying terrible things to him. And the most absurd thing of all is that even after that behavior, they still expected my grandfather to help them. After listening to them yell at him for what must have seemed like an eternity, my grandfather finally warned them that if they didn't leave, he would call the police. That finally made them back down and leave. But the whole situation was incredibly worrying. After hearing all this, I realized that I needed to warn Orson. If my father had been able to show up at my grandfather's house to make such a scene, who was to say he wouldn't do the same at our house? So I called Orson to alert him, but it turned out it was too late. My parents had already been to our house. Orson told me that they had shown up at our door the night before. When I asked him the exact time, I realized that they probably went there after my grandfather had thrown them out of his house. But they behaved in a completely different way with him. Unlike how they treated my grandfather, with Orson they were surprisingly polite, not at all aggressive. He let them in, and they immediately began to apologize for everything they had said to him the last time they spoke. They assured him that they really considered him like a son, and that they were happy that we had been together for so long. More manipulation, just changing the target person. But of course, they couldn't help but insist on the same old excuse, that all they had ever wanted was for us to get married, because in their minds, that was what was best for me. Then, they started complaining that I simply didn't understand that they only wanted the best for me. They told him that I was being stubborn and obstinate. Naturally, Orson defended me, but instead of arguing with him, my parents simply nodded and pretended to agree with everything he said. They tried to justify themselves by arguing about the generation gap, saying that they simply had a different mentality because they belonged to an older generation, which creates a paradox, because that mentality seems even more outdated than my grandfather's. Then they started to tell him about the big argument I had with them the last time we spoke, as if Orson didn't already know the whole story. Obviously, I had already told him everything in detail, so they weren't revealing anything new to him. But my parents were trying to present the situation in a way that made them look like the victims. They said that, although they had been a bit harsh with me, what I had said to them had been much worse. That I had not been respectful to them, and once again, they began to hint that they wanted Orson to talk to me and convince me to apologize. And Orson simply avoided committing himself and did not respond directly. I think after a while, my parents got tired of waiting for me to say what they wanted to hear, because they finally gave up. Before leaving, they told him that they would really appreciate it if he would help them get me to talk to them and apologize. But As expected, he made no promises. He just listened to them without committing himself. He told me that his plan was to call me that same night to inform me of what had happened, but when they left, it was already dinner time, so he got distracted by other things. In fact, he was about to call me this morning, but I got ahead of him. After discussing the whole matter, I suggested that the next time my parents tried to contact him, it would be best to ignore them completely. He was completely on board with this strategy. He had even already considered it. He asked me, half-jokingly, who else they would try to recruit now to manipulate me. Update 4. Several weeks have passed since my parents suddenly turned up at my grandfather's house and then at ours. After all that mess, they didn't try to contact my grandfather again, but they did continue trying to get in touch with Orson. At first, Orson completely ignored them, just as we had agreed. After that visit I mentioned in my last update, he stopped letting them into our house. The first few times they showed up, he simply pretended he wasn't home. But after the third time, he lost his patience. When they tried again, he finally confronted them directly. He told them in no uncertain terms that there was absolutely nothing he could do for them, because I had already made my decision and I had no regrets whatsoever. And besides that, he didn't see any reason for me to have any regrets either. From the way he communicated it to them, it was perfectly clear that he wasn't going to talk to me on their behalf, nor try to convince me to apologize or do whatever it was they wanted. But instead of accepting reality, my parents simply reappeared. What Orson hadn't told them was that next time there would be no more explanations, he would call the police directly. And that's exactly what he did. He left them for a while knocking on the door without opening it, while he called the authorities, and when he confirmed that they were on their way, he went out to entertain them a little longer. That conversation was similar to the previous ones, my parents trying to manipulate, and Orson reiterating that he was not going to give in. Finally, the police arrived, and Orson told my parents that he was tired of playing along, that from that moment on, the police would take care of them. He then asked the officers if they needed him to stay, and they replied that it wasn't necessary, as the call had provided all the information required. So he simply turned around, closed the door, and went about his normal life. My parents were taken to the police station, where they were registered and given a formal warning to stop harassing Orson. This was told to me by my grandfather, who has been following the police case against my parents closely. He also informed me that I could now speak freely on the subject, although I had already mentioned it briefly in a previous update. My grandfather has already removed my father from his position in the company and has found someone to replace him, because my father no longer wants to take on that responsibility. He asked Orson if he would be interested in taking over the position, but he too preferred to continue developing his own professional career. Don't think we're wasting $1 million opportunity. It's simply a family business that has been quite profitable for my grandfather, and it was for my father until recently. But neither Orson nor I are attracted to the idea of running a family business. Update 5. I am sharing with you the consequences my parents have faced after losing the company. As expected, they have not been positive. Although now I don't know who they will be trying to manipulate, because they definitely haven't succeeded with my grandfather. They tried to reason with him, they tried to get him to give my father his job back, but all they got was a threat to call the police when they showed up at his house again. They fled quickly before the authorities arrived, as this would be their second offense, and it would not end with a simple warning. I guess now it's time to use their manipulation techniques on someone who can offer them a job. In the end, it seems that it was not such a good idea for my parents to get married so young, because this has brought them very negative consequences in the long term. It's ironic to see how they are now, the same or worse than when they started their married life. Update 6. 3 years have passed since this whole story began, and Orson and I have finally got married. My parents only had to wait 3 years to see their wish fulfilled. But, unfortunately, they have had to watch it from a distance, because they were not invited to the ceremony. To be fair, we didn't invite many people either, as we opted for something very intimate. Only my grandfather, some close relatives, and a small group of friends attended. It was a simple but meaningful celebration. Sometimes I wonder if my parents felt ashamed for not being invited. I know that the fact that I didn't get married was a source of shame for them, but not having been included in the wedding probably felt equally humiliating to them, right? Anyway, I don't know for sure. I haven't had any kind of relationship with them for all this time, and not even my grandfather has had any contact with them. All I know is that my father got another job, as my grandfather never gave him back his position in the company. I don't know if it's a good job or not, but judging by how little he's bragged about it on social media, from what I've been told, it's probably not something he can be particularly proud of. As for Orson and me, our professional careers have taken off notably, which allows us to begin this new stage of married life and perhaps, in the future, to start a family on a truly solid economic and emotional basis.